spoke earlier. Treasurer, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Fran. Nice to be with you.
Well, you wanted this election campaign to be about the economy. These inflation figures mean it is just that, but it's not great news for any of us, including the government, is it?
Well, international factors are driving inflation higher in Australia, but also around the world. We've seen with the COVID pandemic real pressures on supply chains, Fran, and that has seen freight costs in some cases increasing more than fivefold. With respect to the war in Ukraine, that has seen a spike in both oil and gas prices as well as commodities like wheat, and that plays out through to the supermarket shelves here in Australia as well as at the Bowser. But because of those inflationary pressures, because of those cost of living pressures, we did announce in the budget a pretty comprehensive set of measures to alleviate the cost of living pressures, including halving the fuel excise, which now sees petrol at more than 22 cents lower than what it was going into budget night. People have already started to receive their $250 cheques for 6 million Australians on income support, including pensioners, veterans and carers. $420 has been added to the low and middle income tax offset, which will be available to more than 10 million Australian taxpayers when they put their tax return from the 1st of July. And 2.4 million Australians are getting more affordable and cheaper medicines as a result of measures announced in the budget.
Well, let's look at one of those. Due to international factors, as you say, the rise in fuel prices, the government's cut to the budget excise. The Prime Minister says that will bring inflation costs down by 0.5% in the next quarter. Is that right?
Well, what the budget said is that will reduce inflation, and
by
that is expected to be seen in the June quarter. By actually about a quarter of a percent is the expectation, and that will be into the June quarter. And what we do know is that will make a difference to the inflationary numbers, but we also know that in the context of the broader petrol prices, that budget actually has a forecast for petrol prices to come down as a barrel of oil settles in the September quarter lower than what it has been to date.
OK, so your direct measure will bring inflationary pressures off by about 0.25%, not 0.5%. But can you guarantee then that next quarter inflationary pressures will be reduced by at least that much? That they won't be increasing, they'll be coming down?
Well, again, these are Treasury forecasts, and they have been reaffirmed in the pre-election fiscal outlook, and that was done by the Secretary of Treasury, and that was done by the Secretary of Finance. That's an independent assessment by them.
OK. The inflation figure, though, is not all about international factors. The cost of tertiary education in the last quarter went up 6%. You can't blame that on the war in Ukraine. That's a direct result, isn't it, by the increase in some of your tertiary fees?
We always see inflationary pressures across the economy, but the primary drivers were in food, were in housing, and were in transport.
Well, if you're in higher education, it was a 6% increase to your cost of your degree, and that's as a result of your policy directly, isn't it?
Well, I'd challenge that assumption. I mean, what I could say is you do see prices increase in different areas by different amounts, but the primary drivers of the higher inflation in these numbers were things like transport, because we saw fuel costs up by 35% through the year, 11% for the quarter, and that is the most significant and largest increase through the year since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait back in 1990, more than 30 years ago. So these are significant changes that are happening internationally that are flowing through here in Australia, and that's why we responded in the way we did. But Australia's not immune, Fran, from the international pressures on inflation, because what we've seen in, for example, New Zealand is inflation running at 6.9%, 6.7% in Canada, 7% in the United Kingdom, 8.5% in the United States, all of which is driving up inflation around the world.
Australia's not immune, so it goes to, in this election debate, who's best to manage it. During the pandemic, you added stimulus in the housing market, for instance, with the home builder program for people to build new houses, do renovations. Are we paying the price for that now, though? The construction of new homes rose by 5.7% in the last quarter. A lot of that due to the cost of tradies, supply and demand. Did you overcook the stimulus?
It's actually been driven largely by the increased cost of materials, and again, that's related to supply
and the
chain
increased
disruption.
cost of workforce, it says.
Well, again, we've got an amazing situation we're in now where employers are not seeing high unemployment, they're seeing workforce shortages. We've had our borders closed for the better part of 2 years. That is starting to normalise now with more skilled workers coming in. We've succeeded in saving, lots of apprentices' jobs through this crisis, and that's going to be a very good thing for the economy. But something like Home Builder was an essential program that saw jobs being protected in that long supply chain that supports the housing industry. It was a very important measure that helped support the economy, and it was backed up, dare I say it, by programs at the state level as well. But whether it's Home Builder, whether it was JobKeeper, whether it was the cash flow boost, whether it was what we did with the coronavirus supplement, and whether it was with the Delta outbreak, what we did with the COVID disaster payment, all of these measures have been very important in helping to boost our economy.
All right. Treasurer, most economists expect the RBA to lift rates next week. I don't expect you to comment on that, but what do you say to a couple in New South Wales who'd be facing mortgage increases of around $530 a month by the end of the year, if economists are right in predicting a series of rate rises? That's an extra day's work for a lot of people, and certainly wages growth. Their wages aren't going up by that amount. Why would they reward you with their vote in this election?
Well, as you know, we've tried to alleviate the cost of living in a variety of ways, which we just discussed, but we've also delivered some $40 billion worth of tax relief since the start of the pandemic, while countries like the United States... Yeah, but talk to those mortgage holders, talk to those young mortgage holders. Yeah. What's your message to them? They're going to cop $530 a month extra by the end of the year by the looks of it. Double that by the end of next year, probably. Well, firstly, you're asking me to speculate on a decision that may or may not be taken by the independent board of the Reserve Bank. But what my message is to all Australians is these higher inflation numbers underline just how complex and volatile the global and domestic economic environment is, and how important strong economic management is. Now, the Labor Party have more than $300 billion of additional spending, proposals, commitments, aspirations, all of which could put
$300 billion figure has been challenged widely by Labor. I mean, you've got a lot of sort of talk about speculation, and they also challenge that, isn't it?
And yeah, well, Fran, they also challenged the $387 billion of higher taxes they took to the Australian people. But the Australian people knew that if you voted Labor, you got a retirees tax, you got a housing tax, you got superannuation taxes, you got higher family business taxes, and you got higher income taxes. You see, they just can't be believed. When we ended JobKeeper, they wanted it to be expanded and extended. Anthony Albanese said that when we ended JobKeeper, the economic roof would come crashing down. They were his words.
Okay.
Yet 120,000 more jobs were created the next 3 months. You see, we have got a very clear economic plan that I set out in the budget in just over 2 weeks ago. Yesterday, after 3 years in opposition, the Labor Party produced a 13-page brochure pamphlet with little more than 3 ideas. One was a rehash of Bill Shorten's multinational tax agenda, another was to have a review, and another was to increase more public servants. I mean, that's no economic plan.
Let's stick with housing. The Anglicare rental snapshot today finds 98% of rental properties out of reach for full-time workers on the minimum wage. If mortgage rates go up, rents are likely to go up as investors try to cover their costs. What's your plan to deal with that? I mean, that's a phenomenal figure.
Well, what we already do is provide, more than $5 billion of assistance, rental assistance to more than 1 million Australians. That's very important.
Even with that assistance, Anglicare finds 98% can't afford a rental property. 98% of people on the minimum wage.
And what I've announced in recent budgets is more than $2 billion of additional support for affordable housing through NEFIC, and that sees more than $5.5 billion being expended in that way. And so we've got a plan, obviously, to put in place more affordable housing. We've got a plan to provide people with more rental assistance. States also have obligations in these areas, but we have seen prices go up. in terms of housing, and one of the reasons for that has been the historically low interest rates, but also the strong employment numbers. But again, it's not a challenge for Australia alone. It has been seen around the rest of the world.
Okay. Can we go to your battle in your seat of Kooyong? You missed the Kooyong Candidates Forum in your election last night, I understand. That's surprising, isn't it, given the strong challenge you're facing from the independent Monique Ryan? Why didn't you go?
Well, you didn't tell the full story there, Fran. This is the full story. The forum was organised by a group called Lighter Footprints. It's a climate activist group. It was there to discuss the single issue of climate. In previous years, I've attended that. Well, let me finish. In previous years, I've attended that forum, even though one year someone tried to storm the stage, which what they said was a bucket of bleach to throw over me. Fortunately, it wasn't, and law enforcement prevented them. But when you go to that website, what you would have found is that the people who are responsible for the Lighter Footprints administration are people who include 2 former Greens candidates, the major backer and promoter and advocate for Monique Ryan, who's the fake independent running against me, another person who promoted the my vandalised call flutes and, in those cases, billboards on social media, and then the person called Michael Staindl, who challenged my eligibility to sit in Parliament under Section 44 after the last election, which was a despicable act. And fortunately, not only did he lose, but the court found against him unanimously and awarded costs against him. And he's been one of the key organisers of this Lighter Footprints. So I'm all ready to debate Monique Ryan. In fact, she's refusing to debate me twice, what I've suggested.
Well,
I'm
she's
all
agreed
ready
to a debate in Kooyong, hasn't she? People's Forum.
Hang on. And I've agreed to that as well. But hang on. I'm all ready to debate this fake independent. But I'm not going to go to a rally, a campaign rally for my political opponents, which is all it is. It's not a bipartisan forum. It's a campaign rally for my political opponents.
Well, Labor went.
Now, I've agreed to a Sky for it. Yeah, but the Labor and the Greens are irrelevant here. You can't basically find one of their billboards up in the whole electorate. Why, Fran? Because they're bandied with the independents to run against Liberals in seats like Kooyong. But this is the nub of the issue. My opponent, Monique Ryan, is saying to the community that she wants their vote, yet she won't tell them how she will vote in the event of a hung parliament. And if you elect these fake independents, the likelihood of a hung parliament becomes all that more real. Now, earlier today, this morning, on Radio National, Monique Ryan said she didn't want to front up against me to a Channel 9 debate in a Docklands studio because she wants to stay in the electorate. But earlier this month, she was at events in the suburb of Toorak, events in the suburb of Fitzroy, and tonight is scheduled to hold a fundraiser in the seat of Brunswick, not in the electorate of Kooyong. So why is this so-called independent so loose with the truth? For the very same reason, when they were asked on ABC radio what is their political background, they said they had none. They said they were a political clean skin. They went as far as to say they were a small L Liberal. Well, that's just a lie. That's just false.
Okay.
That's, again, being loose with the truth. So the people of Kooyong deserve to know the truth, and they deserve to have the opportunity to hear 2 debates between me and Monique Ryan. I'm prepared to debate her at a community forum organised by Sky next week, but I'm also prepared to debate her in the Channel 9 studio, which she's refusing to do.
How worried are you about this battle? Because the figures I've just seen show you outspending your Liberal colleagues in other seats on Facebook. In the last week, you spent $21,000 on Facebook ads. Colleagues under similar pressure in seats like Trent Zimmerman, North Sydney, he spent $961. Dave Sharma in Wentworth spent $3,300. What do we read into that?
Well, both candidates in Kooyong are spending significant money on social media.
But do we read into that you've got a bigger problem in Kooyong than Dave Sharma does in Wentworth?
Well, look, I think all these battles will be close. I'm certainly not taking anything for granted in Kooyong, and I've worked very hard for my community since I was elected by them 12 years ago, and feel fortunate to have been elected by them 4 times. I'm from my local area, I'm for my local area, but what we're facing now is a very different dynamic in that the Greens and the Labor Party are just running dead, barely to be seen. The Labor Party and the Greens are supporting these so-called independents. In the case of Kooyong, I'm up against a former long-standing member of the Labor Party who sought to obscure that fact. And there's no detail about their policies, there's no costing of their policies. They are merely a slogan and a billboard.
Okay.
And they're not revealing, despite campaigning on transparency, they're not revealing how they will vote in the event of a hung parliament. And that's not good enough.
Josh Frydenberg, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.